Let's begin first with looking at sines and cosines. So how do we find the derivative of each one? So we're going to look at this diagram here, and if I go clockwise, that's going to be taking the derivative. So clockwise means derivative, and counterclockwise will be antiderivative. Okay, so the derivative of sine is cosine. The derivative of cosine is negative sine. The derivative of negative sine is negative cosine. And the derivative of negative cosine is sine. Now, the derivatives repeat every 4. So, for example, the fourth derivative will be the same thing as the original function. And the way you get the table is you first start off with sine, cosine. And then the opposite side of sine will be negative sine. Then the opposite side of cosine will be negative cosine. Okay. So let's look at a high order derivative. Let's look at the nth derivative of something. So let's start off very simple. I'm going to look at the 20th derivative of sine. Okay. So let f of x be sine. I'm going to look at the 20th derivative of sine. Okay, so sine is over here. This is my starting point. The way we're going to do this is we're going to look at the exponent, divide it by 4, and look at the remainder. So when I take 20, divide it by 4, I get no remainder. So the derivative is itself. Okay, so wherever you start, wherever your function is going to be a 0, remainder 0, and then a 1, 2, and 3. So because the remainder is 0, that means I'm at the start point, which is sine of x. Let's look at the 55th derivative. Well, if I divide this by 4, I get a remainder of 1. So 1 is cosine of x. Okay. Now if I looked at the 119th derivative of x, derivative of sine, well, I divide this by 4, I get a remainder of 3. So I go where the remainder is 3, and that's negative cosine. So this is what it is for sine. Let's say we're looking at cosine or negative sine or negative cosine. So let's look at an example. I'm still going to draw my diagram. And I'm going to start, let's say, with cosine. So let f of x be cosine of x. If I look at the, let's say, 15th derivative, I'm still going to divide the 15 by 4, which the remainder is 1. So wherever I start is my 0. Okay, so I start with cosine. I'm going to let that be 0. And then I work clockwise because the derivatives work clockwise. Okay, so once I reach 3, then I go back to 0. We said the remainder is 3, which is sine. Okay, let's do another example. Let's say we're looking at the 91st derivative. Actually, let's change that to 93rd. So if we're looking at the 93rd derivative, the remainder is 1. So we'll go where the 1 is, and that's at negative sine. All right, now let's look at a negative cosine as the function. So we'll let f of x be negative cosine. We're going to draw out our diagram. So because we're starting at negative cosine, that's going to be our 0. And then we work clockwise by increasing it by 1. Now, if I look at the 13th derivative, well, I do 13 divided by 4 and get a remainder of 1. I go to this diagram where the remainder is 1, and that's clearly sine.